Okay, so for our next news story, well, this one's quite interesting because we're actually reshooting it because we originally shot a segment concerning these new PlayStation 2 emulators for PlayStation 5 and PSP as well. But after recording that segment, we actually took a deeper look and we feel we need to kind of redo this one. It's a redo, John, and you're joining me to talk about it.
Yes, that's right. It's Future John again. We're back. Yeah, for the last direct, I basically opened them up 20 minutes before the show and I was like, all right, this is it. But turns out there's a little bit more to them than I first thought, and they are a little bit weird, shall we say. So to basically fill you in on what's going on here, this is the first round of PlayStation 2 games that are available for PlayStation 5 specifically. Previously, the only way to play PlayStation 2 games through the PlayStation Plus program was to play PlayStation 4 emulator versions of PS2 games. So that's what I covered in my original video, like Jak and Daxter. All the Jak games were there and a bunch of others. They were also known, I believe, to have some problems where there was some games that were glitchy when played on a PS5. So there was clearly an issue with that emulator, right? With these new games, there's stuff like Lego Star Wars, Ghost Hunter, Tomb Raider, Legend, and Sly Cooper now available. The main thing you notice when you open it up is that it now has a PS5 specific menu. So if you tap the PlayStation 5's start button, or whatever you want to call that thing, the start-ish button, it now brings up a menu. Using the PS5 design language, you can choose things like enhancements, video modes, and various other things on there. The enhancements just disable or enable things like rewind and save states and whatnot. The video modes are still bad. It's like the normal one, and then there's this like modern setting that just crushes the blacks for some reason, and it looks stupid.
Okay.
I don't understand why it's there. And then there's two arcade modes, like a arcade classic and an arcade modern. That's just like two variants of a somewhat poor CRT filter that don't really look like a proper CRT filter. So
Okay.
they're not good. I wouldn't recommend any of them. Just use the default. One thing I did notice right away that's interesting is that some of these games, like with Sly Cooper and Tomb Raider, you can actually choose your region from the menu, which I
Okay.
feel like is a step up from what Sony used to do, where like in
Yeah.
certain regions they would force, say, the PAL version, which sucked. Here, you can actually choose, do you want PAL or NTSC? And if you choose the PAL version, you get the PAL version of the game with the different name, which is Sly Raccoon versus Sly Cooper. And it does indeed run slower. It's still 50 hertz in a 60 hertz container, so you get judder. But thankfully, NTSC version is the default. It's there. It works great. Once you get into the game, though, so this is the thing that confused me the first time was, is there a resolution boost or not? And
Right. Okay. Well,
okay,
people think that there isn't, right? Because
right.
Tomb Raider Legend came out and everybody said it was looking blurry. Doesn't look as though there's any resolution increase. People were saying it was running at original resolution. And yeah, we needed to get some metrics on that, right?
Correct. And this is a little bit tricky. So my first impression was, oh, I guess these are just original res. But the problem is I'm still not used to seeing lower res content like this on a 77-inch screen, a screen you also have.
Yes.
And it just, the pixels look gigantic. So, but then I looked closer. I actually pulled into the capture card and started to count stuff. And I'm like, all right, these are still low res, but it's not the same. So on one axis, we got around 576p, which actually sounds
Right.
like, oh, that is like PS2 PAL resolution. And Tomb Raider is a progressive scan game, I believe. But
Mhm.
then on the other one, we got like over 800 something p, which
Right.
is higher
Okay.
than what you could realistically get on a PS2,
Yeah,
especially
it's like
because,
640 and 720 for NTSC and power respectively.
yeah, so PS2 normally, and I suspect this game is probably 640 by 448 or 512
Yeah.
by 448 internally,
Hmm.
with the full progressive lines. And so it's a widescreen game, so it's displayed in 16 by 9, but obviously back then it would be anamorphic. And it's like this on Xbox, GameCube, PS2, where you still have the 4 by 3 image, but you stretch it out so the pixels become wider to get the widescreen. And you don't really see that here. So this actually looks, it is higher res, but it's not high res. It's like a very subtle boost via the emulation that does make it clearer. but it's still the way they do the filtering up to 4K or whatever your output resolution is pretty bad. So it's very blurry. This is especially a problem with the user interface elements like title screen, menus, everything. So those are obviously just the original PS2 assets, stretched, by the way, because the anamorphic mode doesn't account for that in this game. So you just get stretched looking assets, and then they apply like a thick bilinear blur to it. So it ends up looking really, really ugly. Like it's really bad, the UI. And here's what's interesting though. When they show like some of the copyright text and stuff at the beginning of some of these games, you see that same weird filtering artifact that you also saw on the previous emulator on PS4, right?
Right.
Because the way it dealt with these 2D elements, it's very similar between them.
This is just all really baffling, John, and I'll tell you why. It's like when the Classics emulator came along, it was pretty obvious what was wrong with it and what needed to be improved. They've taken a second run at it, and it's still not particularly good. In fact, it sounds like the resolution has actually got lower than the Classics emulator, which was basically a 2x2 boost on each axis.
It might still be that, and it might depend a little on the game. The thing about Tomb Raider is that it actually doesn't specify res enhancement. So even though it does seem to be higher res, it's not in the description. Whereas stuff like Lego, Ghost Hunter, and the like, that does specify an enhancement, and those do seem to be in the 2x on each axis range.
Okay,
on rough counts. Sly Cooper is also interesting because on one axis it's like 2x, but then the other one just comes out around like 480p. But Sly Cooper is a field rendered game, so it uses interlaced rendering. So if you took a single frame, you would only get like 224 lines on a single frozen frame. So what I think they've done is by increasing it 2x, as it jitters between the two interlaced frames, you're actually getting double the amount of data per line. So it's like a weird version of interlaced rendering.
Okay, but it just does still kind of sound as like they haven't really done a particularly effective job with the emulation.
No, I agree. Here. And here's the thing, though. If you pipe an original PS2 into, like, say, a Tink 4K, Retro Tink 4K, or the Morph or something, right? Especially if you put one of the digital mods for it, you can get better image quality than this at native original PS2 res. So even though the rendering res is technically higher, the way that they treat it makes it look perceptibly worse than it should, because of the strong bilinear blur and there's just like no care put into the way that they scale that image to full screen. And it just makes it look dreadful. Versus again, you plug a real PS2 into like a great scaler, you're going to get amazing results. And those are results you can achieve in software with an emulator on a machine like PS5. So they've simply made, I would say, bad choices in regards to image treatment that ultimately hamper their efforts here, and that's a shame. The only thing I will add, though, is that it does seem to improve performance a bit, which is often the case with emulator, because I replayed a section in Sly Cooper on my real PS2, and there's a couple spots where you see the frame rate just dip for a second, right? Doesn't do that on the PS5 emulator, so that's cool. But on the flip side, so there's this entire intro section in Sly where you're in Paris, you're going to steal from the police chief right at the beginning of the game, right? It's the first thing you do. When I played it on PS5, I was like, there's something weird here, right? There's just the dialogue sequences, and then there's just this background, very quiet ambient audio, like police sirens and such. And I thought it felt awkward, so I instantly popped it into my PS2, and there's supposed to be music during this entire scene. And Oliver, you can put it up right here. I actually captured this. And just take a listen here to this PS2 emulation version. There's no sound there's no music in the background, right? Which that's a glitch. And if you restart it, it seems to be okay, but it's just an odd little emulation glitch that popped up, and the levels after that actually did have music. So something else is wrong there. That's not great.
Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't seem like a particularly well-realized emulator, again.
Yeah. It's acceptable enough. It plays the games. There's major room for improvement. And like people like us, we know the secret to make this look better. We're not the only ones either. there are ways to massively improve this. They're just not doing it. And I'm genuinely confused by some of those decisions.
Yeah, it is bizarre, and I've said this in the past. Why, Sony are unable to do this while the retro hardware community is producing banger after banger in terms of like upscalers and whatnot. And if you're actually saying that the original games running at the original, at the original resolutions, going through, processors like the RetroTink are producing better results than these emulators, which are apparently running at higher resolutions. That's just bizarre. And also, when you're talking about the modes being not particularly effective, this is kind of like a bit bizarre because, again, this has been, I wouldn't say solved, but it's certainly been, addressed by the retro hardware community to a much higher standard. It's just completely baffling. I mean, I just can't quite accept that Sony's just sort of ignoring the fact that all of these advances have been made and actually taking it on board as opposed to doing what they're doing here, which just doesn't seem particularly effective.
I agree completely. And it's not just PS2 either. We went back to look at some of the PSP stuff as well. Specifically, they just released Daxter on the PSP. And this seems to be largely similar to what we saw before in that it just runs in a much higher resolution than the original PSP game. Some elements are filtered, some are not, which I guess is consistent with the original. But I don't really like the image treatment there either, but it's probably better than what they did on PS2. The problem is, though, is that for games with 30 FPS cap, there seems to be a frame persistence issue where you get sort of frame pacing problems, but not consistently. So like in Daxter, it was just fine initially, and you can see it in my frame rate graph here. But then I went in, skipped the cutscene, and then I'm in this little room here. And as you see now, the frame time graph just goes to heck. It's completely messed up, and it's very jittery. And Oliver spent more time with these like Resistance and the like, and apparently those are even worse. And the games just they don't present correctly as they did on a real PSP. So again, it's sort of like insulting the legacy of it. And especially in the PSP case, again, you look at, again, I keep bringing it up, but this RetroTink, these scalar hardware, they have these amazing ways to simulate like sub-pixels on a PSP, of the PSP screen, the pixel grid of an LCD, and beautifully blow it up on a large 4K display to make the games look good. They could even do that with like downsampling, where you like output to like a virtualized pixel grid, but you're rendering internally higher res, then back down to that res. There's so many things you can do to make these games look both authentic but also more attractive. And this just feels like the laziest, not to say lazy devs, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying like the selections they made on the actual settings feel lazy, where they didn't think about how to make these games look best. They're just like, it's like starting an emulator for the first time and just like clicking a couple buttons and being done with it. I don't like the choices they made. And
it's baffling.
And the fact that it's just this PS1, PS2, and PSP only, it also makes for some weirdness, because like I was scrolling through the store and I said, oh, there's Tekken 6 on PS4 and PS5. That's sweet. But then it occurred to me, wait, it's the PSP version of Tekken 6, which, by the way, is very impressive for PSP. But if you're thinking like I'm going to download Tekken 6, you're thinking like the proper console version of Tekken 6, right? So it's funny to see games like that put up here on the store, because it's not really, and I guess it's the same with Tomb Raider Legend in a way, because there was obviously PC, 360, and even a PS3 version later in that HD collection of Tomb Raider, right? That are all much more advanced. The 360 version was known for, they added all that cool like pixel shader stuff and lots of more advanced rendering techniques. But it's also symbolic of that era where I believe the original Xbox version of Tomb Raider Legend is a 60 FPS game, if I recall. And then the 360 version is like 20 to 30. In 720p, so it's like extremely choppy. It's worse than any other version. If you drop the 360 version to 480p, it actually smooths it out, and it's just 30. But there's nice enhanced visuals, but it runs a lot worse than the last gen version, which was very.
So it sounds like just generally Sony has still got work to do here. But if this is their do-over, it's not particularly compelling, is it?
No, and I don't like if they really cared about these. And maybe, I don't know how important this is to the bottom line, but I feel like they're just they're missing something here. Like, I feel like if you brought in the right people, even people like us, to come in and be like, all right, this is how we need to tackle this, revisiting these classics. There is a way to bring your legacy forward onto these machines and present it in a way that is extremely respectful and really helps users appreciate and understand these games from the past. Instead, they're just kind of buried here in this essentials menu, whatever. It's a bunch of random emulators jumbled together. None of them are configured well. The whole thing just feels really sloppy in a way that sucks. So I'm not impressed with this.